One, two, three, four. How many meals per day should you eat? Hey guys, Coach Matt here. Today I want to dive into this topic of how many meals per day you should eat. Now, if you've been following me around, then you know that should is actually a word that I don't love. But it's a question that I get asked all the time, so let me give you my answer. So here we go. Let's dive right in. Obviously, if you know me, it depends. Now, I've given you a visual chart here to try to talk about and help you visualize what it means to eat 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 or more meals per day. And this chart is based on the same person eating from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. The same amount of total calories, 2,400 in this example, per day on average, with a roughly even spread. Obviously, there could be some variance here from day to day, but you get the point. So, if we click on one meal, what you'll see here is that if you want to do that in one meal, you have to eat all of that food in one meal. Okay, so that's going to be a very big meal. If any of you have ever tried to eat 2,400 calories a day from whole foods, that's not so easy. Okay, yes, you could do that from processed, ultra processed foods pretty quickly, but that's a topic for another lesson. Okay, you can see the point that you would have to eat quite a large amount of food in one meal, and obviously, if you were going to split that up into two meals, that would be, and maybe this person puts the second meal a little bit later, but that would be a lot easier. But let me just tell you right now, if you're eating a diet that has a significant portion of whole foods, it's not the easiest thing to eat a meal that is 1,200 calories either. That's a pretty big meal. I do it sometimes, and I eat a lot of food, but that's not so easy for most people. Okay. 3 meals a day, of course, it goes down. In this diet, it would be 800 calories per meal. Turns out that if you've never measured or counted your calories, that's about the size of an average dinner plate, more or less, roughly speaking, right? Depending on what's on the plate, of course. And then, of course, as we go to 4, now what you start to see here is also, though, as you increase the number of meals you're having, you're eating for longer, which, of course, we're going to talk about in the next slide. But here's what 4 meals a day looks like, right? So now you're forcing yourself more or less to eat, most of the day. And those are smaller meals. Of course, the meals are getting smaller. And then the last one in the 5+ meal category, I've just divided it into 5 here. Now you are in that scenario having, ultimately, if you're going to eat the same size meal, roughly speaking, every time, you're going to have to eat from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. to get that done. And a 500 calorie meal is a pretty small meal. Okay. So that's like 5 small meals. Okay. So that makes sense. I'm sure it's obvious with the numbers, but what's not so obvious is, well, what's all this talk I hear about some people doing 1 meal a day or fasting for, 20 hours or 16 hours. And what is all this like? What's the best thing for me to do, Matt? Like, how should I do this? Okay. So let's go to the next slide and we'll start to unpack that a bit more. Okay. So some things to consider are here as follows. What really matters most is what you can stick to consistently, right? So just because you hear some people on the train or at the water cooler talking about how rigorously they fast, and only eat for 4 hours a day total, that is not practical for most people. And I'll dive into that a little bit more in an ensuing slide. Can you plan and prepare for this plan that you want to make, right? So if you want to try eating 4 meals a day or 2 meals a day or something different, right? Can you actually execute that? Will it fit into your personal and work life, right? So if you're eating, like going back to here, this chart, right? This person is eating, may not be eating alone for that meal, but the rest of the day, he or she is not eating with family or friends. He may be sitting with family or friends, but he's not eating. And that's okay, if that's okay for him and his family and friends. But I just need to point that out, that that's an unconventional social situation, right? And then, of course, how does it make you feel, right? Going back here, these 2 scenarios, these are big meals, right? So do you like to eat that much food? Does it, can you even do it, right? Or is it going to make you feel like you've just had the biggest Thanksgiving dinner ever and it's completely bloated? That's probably not good either, right? So moving on, let's just I've already touched on a couple of these, but I outlined 2 slides of pros and cons for lower and higher meals here. So, as I see it, possible pros and cons for eating fewer meals, right, are that you do get more time being fasted, okay, and you do spend less total time eating, right, and some people like that style of eating, right. Of course, the cons I mentioned already, that those are very large meals, and that's an unusual schedule, and it does require more planning, right? So, in other words, you can't just wake up tomorrow and eat this or this plan, like without having the food available, right? Or having the time to cook it. So, if you work from home, if you don't work from home, that is very difficult to do for most people. Okay. Some pros and cons though of having more meals per day. Pros are that you have less time being fasted. Now, keep in mind that's a possible pro. You could put that in the con side. That's why I use the word possible here. But I should edit that to say, less time being hungry, right? If that's a pro for you. Of course, there are benefits of fasting. I'll get to that in a minute. Another pro there would be more total time spent eating, right? So if you're a person who likes to eat all the time, then that's good for you, right? That may not be everyone, but that could be good for some people. And similarly, some people enjoy lots of smaller meals, right? And then so some potential cons there are that it does require more total energy to prepare all those meals and to eat all those meals all the time. That takes time and energy from your body and mental energy. And then in this scenario, you may be eating alone because not everybody else eats 5 meals a day. And you're going to be eating late, particularly if you're having 5 or more meals a day, right? And so that also, they both require more planning. Both this scenario and this one require more planning, of course, than just 3 meals a day. But before we get to the 3 meal a day thing, let's go here. A couple of myths to bust here, right? So I've outlined some of the pros and cons, some of what's practical and what's not practical for some. But there are some myths to bust here, right? You may hear some people talk about how it's all about fasting or intermittent fasting or time restricted eating, and that's just not the case, right? So you cannot escape the energy balance equation, all right? I'll do a whole nother video on what the energy balance equation is, but it's a law of thermodynamics, that the calories in, calories out equation that I'm sure you've heard about and debated about on social media. But the bottom line is you cannot escape that, right? So if you need to eat 2,400 calories a day to maintain your body weight, and you eat less than that on average over time, you will lose weight. You cannot escape that, right? Similarly, if you and vice versa, if you overeat that, if you exceed that too often, you will gain weight. So whether or not you have no matter what your feeding window, right? So you can't escape that law. So is it better or worse to have a smaller feeding window? It really depends, right? Because there is no one diet for everyone. And also, the evidence shows that time-restricted eating and intermittent fasting are not better for those trying to lose weight significantly than just conventional caloric deficit. Meaning, simply put, that following a slight caloric deficit and still eating in a standard window can achieve the same results as shrinking your feeding window, if not better results, right? So there's lots of debate out there. I could point you to Alan Aragon and others who cite the research, but their conventional evidence shows that it is not true that fasting is better than not fasting. Fasting for long periods of time is better than not fasting for long periods of time for weight loss, okay? So again, it really depends, okay? What matters most is really what you can stick to. So we have grandma to thank for that, right? So there is some conventional practical wisdom out there that I don't necessarily want to live and die by every phrase that I grew up with, but the fact that 3 meals a day is like baked into most cultures is not an accident, right? So there's some conventional wisdom there, and it makes sense, right? So it doesn't mean you have to eat that way. There are many days that I eat 2.5 meals or 2 meals. That's just my personal preference. But 3 meals a day, that is a good thing for most people, okay? I recommend a minimum of 12 hours fasting, which is much more practical than, say, fasting for 18 or 20 hours. So that's what I showed you on the slide in the beginning, right? If you start eating at 8 p.m., You should probably be done eating by 8 a.m. Excuse me. You should probably be done eating by 8 p.m. if not sooner. I typically recommend people to finish eating 3 hours before they go to sleep. Okay, so you can think about that. That's a topic potentially for another video as well. But you certainly don't want to be eating lots of food right before you go to bed. But I think if you're fasting, and so if you're fasting for 12 hours, meaning not eating for 12 hours, that's good enough to give your body a chance to do the digestion that it needs to do for most people. Again, I do a bit more than that. I probably fast for an average of 14 to 16 hours a day, depending. So let's just say call it 15, but 12 is a good minimum to shoot for. Okay. Don't ruin your life. Okay. That's the last thing I want to put there. Meaning that, if you want to try one of these more extreme schedules, okay, but don't let it ruin your social life, your family life, or your professional life, right? Because that's part of your health too. And I have an entire course about that for free in my mini course that you see there linked at the bottom, about what's really most important in health. In fact, since we're ending on that note, you can get free coaching on what's most important for your health in my free Skool community. The link is in my bio. The link is there, skool.com/vitality. There's lots of great stuff in there. Don't just take my word for it. You have these raving testimonials here from real people. And I want to thank you if you've made it this far. So what should you eat? It depends. How many meals a day should you eat? It totally depends on you. 3 meals a day is probably best and easiest and most practical for most people to stick to. The more you stray from that, the more you'll have to deal with some of the pros and cons I mentioned, but I can absolutely see how lots of people do well with 2 or 2.5 or 3.5 or 4. But when we start to get into those outer edges, that's going to be a small group of people who really do well with those schedules. All right. Thank you for watching.